I never planned to be anyone's mother. Not like this, not at 34, not because a 5-year-old boy knocked on my apartment door at 2 in the morning holding a stuffed rabbit and said, "My mommy isn't waking up." I remember standing there in my pajamas, completely frozen. I had never even met this child before. I knew my neighbor, a quiet woman named Sandra who moved in about 3 months earlier, but we had only ever exchanged a few words in the hallway. A smile here, a quick hello there. That was it. I didn't even know she had a son. But there he was. Small, barefoot, wearing a little blue dinosaur shirt, with the most serious expression I had ever seen on a child's face. And behind him, the door to apartment 4B was wide open. I didn't think. I just grabbed my phone and went with him. Sandra was unconscious on the kitchen floor. An ambulance came within minutes. The paramedics were calm and professional, but I could see from their faces that it was serious. One of them asked me if I was a family member, and I said, "No, I'm just the neighbor." He nodded and said someone needed to stay with the boy. I looked down at him. He was holding my hand. He had grabbed it at some point, and I hadn't even noticed. So I stayed. His name was Leo. He told me that himself, very quietly, while we sat in the hallway outside my apartment waiting for someone, anyone, to figure out what was supposed to happen next. I asked him if he was hungry and he nodded. I made him toast with butter and cut it into triangles because for some reason that felt important. He ate every piece and then asked me if his mommy was going to be okay. I told him yes. I didn't know if that was true, but I told him yes. The social worker arrived around 4 in the morning. A tired woman with kind eyes who explained to me, very gently, that Sandra had no emergency contacts listed anywhere. No family in the city. No close friends they could reach. And Leo, sweet, serious Leo, who was now asleep on my couch wrapped in my grandmother's old quilt, had nowhere to go that night except a temporary emergency placement, which basically meant a stranger's house and a strange bed and a room full of children he didn't know. I heard myself say, "He can stay here tonight." The social worker looked at me for a long moment. She said she would need to do a quick check, ask me a few questions, see my ID. I said of course. And 2 hours later, Leo was officially in my temporary care for the night. Except the night turned into a week. Sandra had suffered a severe neurological event. That's how the hospital described it. She was stable, but completely unresponsive. The doctors weren't sure when or if she would wake up. And Leo had no one. His father wasn't in the picture. Sandra had apparently left that situation before Leo was even born and had no contact information, no last known address, nothing. Her only listed relative was a sister in another state who, when the social worker finally reached her, said she couldn't take a child right now. Just like that. I can't take a child right now. I remember the social worker telling me this over the phone, and I just stood in my kitchen staring at the wall while Leo sat at my table drawing pictures of rockets and dogs. He had started calling me Miss Anna. Not because I told him to, just because that's what he decided. And I thought, what am I doing? I had a job. A regular life. A 1-bedroom apartment with 1 set of dishes and absolutely no idea how to raise a child. I had never even wanted children in the traditional sense, not because I disliked them, but because life had just gone a different direction, and I had made peace with that. But every morning Leo woke up and padded into my kitchen in his socks and said, "Good morning, Miss Anna," like it was the most normal thing in the world. And every evening I read him 2 pages from whatever book we had found at the library that week, and he fell asleep before I finished, and I sat there in the dark next to him thinking, this is the strangest thing that has ever happened to me. The social worker called again at the end of the 2nd week. She said they had found a foster family who could take Leo, a couple across the city with experience, a proper room, everything. She said it was a good placement. She said I had done more than enough. I thanked her. I hung up the phone. And then I sat down on the bathroom floor and cried for 20 minutes, which told me everything I needed to know about where this was going. I called the social worker back the next morning. I told her I wanted to apply for official foster care status so Leo could stay with me while Sandra was in the hospital. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Are you sure about this?" And I said yes, even though every logical part of my brain was screaming that I was absolutely insane. The process was not simple. There were background checks and home inspections and paperwork that seemed to multiply every time I thought I was close to finishing. I had to take a mandatory training course over 2 weekends, which meant asking my colleague Maria to cover for me at work without explaining the full situation because I didn't even know how to explain it to myself yet. I rearranged my entire apartment, turned my small office corner into a proper sleeping space for Leo with a real bed and a lamp and a little shelf for his books. I bought dinosaur sheets because of course I did. Leo watched all of this with those serious eyes of his, and one evening he asked me, "Miss Anna, are you going to keep me?" And I looked at him and I said, "I'm going to try really hard." He thought about that for a second and then nodded like we had just agreed on something official. Then he went back to his drawing. 6 weeks after that knock on my door, I became Leo's official temporary foster parent. It was harder than I expected and also somehow easier. The hard parts were real. The nightmares he had twice a week where he woke up crying for his mom. The mornings when he refused to eat and just sat there staring at nothing. The parent-teacher meeting at his kindergarten where I had to explain the situation to a teacher who looked at me with this careful expression, like she was trying to figure out exactly what I was. The easy parts surprised me. The way he laughed at completely random things. The way he had already memorized which mug was mine and always put it next to the coffee machine in the morning without being asked. The way he said Miss Anna like it was one word, one sound, something that just belonged together. Sandra woke up 11 weeks after the night Leo knocked on my door. The hospital called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in a work meeting, and I stepped out into the hallway and just stood there shaking while the nurse explained that Sandra was conscious, responsive, and asking about her son. I drove to the hospital that same evening. I didn't bring Leo, not yet. I needed to see her first. She was thin and pale and looked like someone who had been somewhere very far away and had just found her way back. She looked at me from the hospital bed and said, "You're the neighbor." I said, "Yes." She said, "You kept him." And I said, "I tried to." She cried. I cried. It was a lot. The weeks that followed were delicate in a way I don't have a perfect word for. Sandra needed rehabilitation, physical and neurological, which meant she wasn't going home anytime soon. But she was present, she was improving, and she was Leo's mother. We set up video calls every evening. The first time Leo saw her on the screen, he went completely still for about 3 seconds, and then started talking so fast I couldn't follow a single word. Sandra laughed through tears, and I had to leave the room because I was not going to fall apart in front of a 5-year-old. We found a rhythm. Sandra and I talked regularly, at first about Leo, then about everything else. She told me about her life before she moved to our building, the reasons she had ended up alone, the things she was working through. I told her about my life, my work, my very unexpected journey through the foster care system. We became, in the most unusual way possible, friends. For months after she woke up, Sandra came home. I was there that day. Leo had made a sign out of cardboard and markers that said "Welcome Emma" in very large uneven letters because he had seen the word welcome somewhere and interpreted it creatively. Sandra walked through her apartment door, looked at the sign, and sat down on the floor right there in the entryway and held him for a long time without saying anything. I stood in the hallway and watched through the open door and thought, okay, this is the ending. But it wasn't quite the ending because 2 days later Sandra knocked on my door. She was standing there with Leo beside her, and she had this expression that was both serious and a little nervous, and she said, "We talked about it, Leo and I. And we want to ask you something." Leo looked up at me with those steady, serious eyes and said, "Miss Anna, can you be my emergency person? Like, officially?" I looked at Sandra. She smiled and said, "I'm updating my emergency contacts." I thought, if you're willing, your name should be first on the list. I told them yes. Leo nodded like we had just agreed on something official, exactly the same way he had nodded 4 months earlier in my apartment. Then he held up his stuffed rabbit and said, "Gerald thinks it's a good idea too." I laughed. Sandra laughed. And the 3 of us stood there in the doorway between our 2 apartments, and it felt exactly like what it was, the beginning of something that had no name yet, but didn't need one.